Good evening, everyone. I'm thrilled to welcome you to the inaugural BookEnds Book Club. I'm Jennifer Solheim, the Associate Director of the BookEnds Novel Revision Fellowship, part of the Lichtenstein Center at Stony Brook University. BookEnds was founded in 2017 by co-directors Susan Scarf-Merrill and Meg Pulitzer, with the aim of supporting writers in polishing their novels for readership. Each year since, Meg and Susie have worked with a small cohort, organized into smaller working pods of 3, through an outlining process that allows writers to see the strengths and larger arc in their story, and through an intensive reading and revising of each pod's work. In the second half of the year, each cohort member works one-on-one with an established novelist to revise a second time in preparation for a full reading and discussion with an agent. The program has been highly successful, with 8 novels either published or under contract with either Big 5 or reputable small presses, more than half of BookEnds alums represented by agents, and an active alumni group that includes support for revision, querying, publication, and promotion of the work. So we decided this year to open our community to the public in celebration of novels newly published by BookEnds mentors or fellows, and tonight is our first event. Each book club features 2 members of our community who have worked together in order to honor and discuss the writing and revision of a newly published work. You can order signed copies of the book club's guests through the night of the event from Southampton Books by clicking on the link in the description below. Before I introduce tonight's guests, we'd like to invite you all to join us on April 5th, when program co-director Susie Merrill will be in conversation with her BookEnds 2020 mentee, Daisy Alpert-Florin, whose BookEnds novel, My Last Innocent Year, was both an editor's choice and subject of the group text discussion this past month at the New York Times. On May 24th, 2 members of the BookEnds pilot program in 2017-18 will be in conversation. Vanessa Cuty's debut novel, The Tip Line, is forthcoming with Crooked Lane Press, and she will discuss it with Allison Fairbrother, whose BookEnds novel, The Catch, was also a New York Times editor's choice in 2022. Without further delay, I'm so delighted to welcome our guests for this evening. Caitlin Mullen is a graduate of both the Stony Brook MFA program as well as BookEnds, where she worked on her novel, Please See Us, a New York Times top 10 best crime novel of 2020, and the Edgar Award winner for best first novel in 2021. The focus of our discussion tonight is Kate's BookEnds mentor, also Stony Brook Interim Associate Provost and Pulitzer Prize winning novelist Paul Harding, whose new book, This Other Eden, is described by poet Dinez Smith as a novel written out of poetry and sunlight, violent history and tender remembering, dreamlike but tangible, so real it could make you weep. Paul will give a short reading, followed by conversation between Paul and Kate. I'll be moderating the chat, so there will be plenty of time for questions. Don't hesitate to join in the conversation through the chat feature below. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Paul and Kate.
Great pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jen.
Shall I begin with reading a brief reading from the book? I'm just going to read a page, just a page, because it's the most fun is had when we all talk with each other. But this is just a little page from the beginning of the book. The book begins with a retelling of kind of a local tall tale. So the book is set on an island off the coast of southern Maine. At the time of this telling, it's 1912, and the telling is a story about a hurricane that struck the island 100 years before the main action of the story. So here's just a little bit of it. A hurricane struck in September of 1815. 22 years after Benjamin and Patience Honey had come to the island and begun the settlement, by which time there were nearly 30 people living there in 5 or 6 houses, including the first Proverbs and Lark folks, the ones from Angola and Cape Verde, the others from Edinburgh. Patience herself from Galway, Ireland, originally, before she met Benjamin on his way through Nova Scotia and went with him. And 3 Penobscot women, sisters who'd lost their parents when they were little girls. A surge of seawater 20 feet high funneled up the bay, sweeping houses and ships along with it. When the wall of ocean hit, it tore half the trees and all the houses off the island, guzzling everything down, along with 2 honeys, 3 proverbs, 1 of the Penobscot sisters, 3 dogs, 6 cats, and a goat named Enoch. The hurricane roared so loudly, Patience Honey thought she'd gone deaf at first. That is, until she heard the tidal mountain avalanching toward them, bristling with houses and ships and trees and people and cows and horses churning inside it, screaming and bursting and lowing and neighing and shattering and heading right for the island. Then she knew all might well be lost, that this might well be the judgment of exaltation, the sealed message unsealing, that after they'd all been swept away by the broom of extermination, there'd be so few trees left standing, a young child would be able to count them up, and their folks would be scarcer than gold. But not all gone, not everyone. Patience knew. Some honeys would persist, some proverbs survive. A lark or 2 might endure. For reasons she could never afterward explain, she snatched the homemade flag she'd stitched together from patches of the stars and stripes and the Portuguese crown and golden Irish harp shaped like a woman who looked so much like a figurehead and always reminded her husband of the one on the front of the ship he'd been a sailor on that had sunk off the coast and brought him to the island in the first place. And the faded, faint squares embroidered with Bantu triangles and diamonds and circles that he'd carried with him everywhere, that he showed her meant man and woman and marriage and the rising sun and the setting sun, that he always said were his great-grandfather's, although she, in her heart of hearts, didn't think that could be true, and tied it like a scarf around her throat. And she took Benjamin by the hand and dragged him from their shack out into the whirlwind. She swore it was a premonition because no sooner had she and her husband passed out the door than the house broke loose from its pilings and tumbled away behind them, bouncing and breaking apart into straw like a bale of hay, bouncing off a rick and into the ocean. Now that she stood in the open, facing the bedlam, her legs would not work. She was sure that this was the judgment, and what was to be was to be. It was useless to try to outrun the outstretched arm of the Lord. So there's a little sampler of the delights to be found within.
Okay. Paul, can I ask you a question about that passage to start off?
Absolutely.
So you mentioned too, and this passage you just read is part of like this foundational myth to these Apple Islanders, and it's situated in the novel too as a story that's being told by one of the honey's descendants, Esther, telling it to her grandchildren. Do you remember when you wrote this part of the novel, and how was that always going to be like the sort of underpinning of the book, the story of the flood and the story of the expulsion? Do you remember like at what point in the process you actually wrote this passage?
Yeah. And so for folks who maybe haven't had a look at the book, it's the basic setting of the novel is it's an island off the coast of a small island off the coast of southern Maine. It's based on an historical occurrence that had to do with a racially integrated community that was on this island from the early 1790s until 1912, when the state of Maine, in historical fact, had the community evicted from the island. And when I found out about this community, and was thinking about the fact that they're on an island, and for some reason, because so much of what I write is just me thinking about and in conversation with all my favorite books. So when I thought of an island, the first things I was, the first sorts of things I was thinking of were like the island in Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. I was thinking of Noah's Ark. The island is almost like an ark. And that was one of the first things I thought of. And also I thought, because Moby Dick is never far from my mind, I thought it was being almost like the Pequod, with the sort of United Nations of sailors on it. So I had all these different kind of facets or takes on the island that I wanted to kind of refract it through. And so I think that pretty early on, I would have written this hurricane piece. It's probably within the first year of starting to work on the book. And so it was suggested to me because, there's Noah's Ark, and so there's the flood. There's the big flood in Genesis, and even the flood in Genesis is it's a retelling of even older sort of Babylonian flood narrative. So I felt like this idea of these people being displaced by flood and catastrophe and all this sort of stuff, just something that was eternal or eternally human in a sort of a perennial story. But then I just, when you're a writer, you want to write stuff that's a challenge and that's interesting to you. Sort of like, so when you're actually sitting in the chair every day, you're engaged and challenging yourself. So I was just like, that's cool. What would be fun would be I write such, kind of quiet birch bark metaphysics so much. I thought, I'm going to see if I can just do like a rip roaring kind of like high wire, just virtuosic, just like a big storm piece. I wanted it to be like open it up with like a big operatic kind of thing. And so then it just became a challenge of trying to, write about that scene goes on for another 6 or 7 pages, or 5 pages or something. And so it just became interesting about how do you keep writing about this giant wave that's full of all the detritus of this island and just keep it rolling and rolling and rolling, but also gathering up, meaning as it goes along.
Yeah, there's that sense of accumulation that builds through the passage, and it's like physical accumulation of like destruction, accumulation of like the threat and loss to these islanders. I definitely, that makes sense. That's like sort of that was your imperative in that scene for sure. Can I ask you a question about the sort of initial spark of inspiration for the novel? You mentioned Malaga Island, which sort of served as your jumping off point for this book. Yeah. When did you come across that story, and when did you feel like that could be your next book? Like, when do you, what's the difference between hearing an idea and having something pass through you and then being able to sort of jump into it as a novel project?
Yeah, that's a great question, because the way that the book came together is I had no idea what to write, but I had a 2-book contract, and my people were already asking about pages. So one of the things I did is I just picked a random kind of scene to start writing that I knew wouldn't be the book. I just needed some kind of a scene to start working on. So what I actually did is I actually went back to my second novel, Enon. I went back to a very minor character in Enon, who's this sort of 80 or 90-year-old woman who's sort of very wealthy, and she's the grande dame of this local village. And I just thought, maybe interesting to just go back and kind of start doing a character sketch of her when she was maybe 10 years old. And so I started writing about her and her family's meadow, on their big estate, and she's with like an Irish nanny. And so I was just thinking about that. And as always, I'm just like, especially in really the earliest stages of writing a novel, I just kind of throw everything into the book, just like whatever is cool, because if it'd be cool to see if stuff that looks like it's separated ends up kind of getting implicated together. And if not, you can always just chuck it, years later. And so I was, among other things, I was just reading, I happened to be reading about the rise of labor unions after the Civil War in the United States. And it just struck me. It was just one of those, that there must have been all Black and racially integrated communities after the Civil War. So I just Googled it, and of course, all these places started popping up. And one of the earliest ones that popped up was Malaga Island. And since I had written about Maine, and Maine kind of has this place in my imagination, I thought that's interesting. And then I discovered that one of the families who was evicted from the island was actually committed as a family to this place called the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded, which had served as a model for an asylum that one of the characters in Tinkers almost gets sent to. And so you start, as you're a writer, like we're always going, please, universe, give me a sign, walking around the dowsing rod kind of thing. I was like, this is interesting. And then I found out the deal maker was, I found out that kind of almost to the week that these people were evicted from the island, the first International Congress on Eugenics was happening in London. So I started thinking about that and thinking about writing about that. The minute I knew that my imagination had been sort of laid claim to by that, I stopped doing any research, because one thing that was very apparent from the beginning was that I don't have any organic connection to the actual community in Malaga. So the real, like any kind of like historical novel that used the real historical people and the care just wasn't mine to write. So I immediately started to try to work up an imagined version of it. So in my other, one of the other things is that I'm kind of a junkie for, I love painting, and I kind of haunt museums, and I love landscape painting, and I love still life painting as well. So I'd been reading about this 19th century painter, an artist named Charles Ethan Porter. He was a Black guy, late 19th century. And I was looking at his paintings, and I came across this beautiful painting of a meadow that had been mowed, and it was full of, studded with haystacks. So literally I was like, oh, that looks like, to me in my mind's eye, the meadow that I've been farting around with the, the 10-year-old girl and her. So all I did, and this is just, it's as simple and as stupid, I literally just plunked him in the background of their scene and just had somebody in the scene say, who's that out there painting? And somebody just says, oh, I don't know, Dad invited him, he's supposed to be here all summer. When I found out about Malaga Island and went back to that scene, it was just one of those things. When they pointed him out again, I just knew he's from Malaga Island. And how did this person get from Apple Island in the novel, but how did this person get from this island, this kind of catastrophe is going to befall the folks, and into the setting of my last novel, my fictional town of Enon. So it was just these kind of happy accident,
Yeah, that's reassuring to hear, like that, like this novel that ultimately feels so like cohesive and layered. And I mean, I know that comes from, years and years of spending time with these characters in this work, but that it started in a way that to you felt a little more patchwork and haphazard.
Absolutely. I just kept adding stuff without insisting that any of it connect really immediately. I just like, oh, this is interesting, and I like this kind of a scene. Probably for 3 or 4 years, and then there was this one, like, okay, there's just one point kind of in the middle of writing the book where I just had to take kind of all the different pieces and sort of see if I could cinch them all together. And they kind of worked. I was like, ooh, this might be, because I like to do that. I like to not know what's happening. I like to know, like not have a plan. I like to just improvise and fiddle around with stuff. Very, very inefficient. It's just exhaustive, just like try this and try this and try this. But what I like about that then is that when things work and when they start to synthesize, you start getting things that you never would have dreamed of or imagined, or I would have never dreamed of or imagined. So I like being surprised by the material and go, oh, they know each other, or they know the same song, or finding these things out that I couldn't have. I'm not smart enough to think up on my own.
Yeah, it's like that point where you get to, there's like that nice like saturation point where like all the answers start to come from the book rather than from you, when your subconscious is sort of churning away.
That's exactly what you're hoping for. That moment where Marilyn Robinson, my binky Marilyn, she would always talk about, what you want is the ideal is sort of, you want every sentence in the novel, you want everything in the novel to embody its own meaning, so that the book actually becomes an iteration of its own subject, if that makes sense. And there is that kind of that idea that like every word feels like it's connected with every other word. There's this resonance among it's just this kind of organic sort of poetic tissue or something like that.
Yeah, it sort of all becomes its own system that reinforces itself,
Exactly.
reiterates, and there's resonances. And yeah, I think, it's like, I just want to get to that point in writing.
Yeah,
That's what
I know.
really exciting, I think.
Yeah. And most of the time it's just like, most days where it's just like you pick up the shovel, you get back in the ditch, and you just like, and it's, but one of the things this is the third novel I've completed now. And I've talked about this with my students a lot lately, but I've just come to think that what we usually call revisionist writing, because it's like going back over and going, I can make that a little bit better. I need to bring that, it's a little clearer. The language needs to be more precise. And, and really I'm obsessed with just writing sentences that have literal meaning, and thinking that then when you connect them and they aggregate into large, into paragraphs or whatever, that's where you start to get figurative, like meaning with a capital M, but just having everything be really, really, really crystal clear so that the reader is, one of my ideas, to have language that's so clear that the reader forgets they're actually reading printed words.
Yeah, I have a question for you about that I think relates to the paintings. So there's a passage here, and I won't read from the whole passage, although it's very beautiful, and it's Ethan, your painter character, Ethan Honey, looking at a painting of a bundle of asparagus in the house of his wealthy benefactor, sort of stealing a glance at this lovely painting. And it says, Ethan leaned closer and closer to the painting, trying to see how it was possible, trying to see how the painter had turned a handful of plants into an emblem for the whole world. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about this. To me, felt so representative of the experience of reading the book, just all these things sort of lifted to the light. And if you could talk about this elevation of the ordinary that Ethan understands, innately as an artist. How does that relate to you? How does that relate to the job of the writer in your mind?
Yeah, well, that's a perfect example of what we were just talking about. That idea, that's another thing that as a writer I've learned to do is when I say, oh, I want it to embody its own meaning, or I want it to be, I just gave that idea to the character and had him say, how did something that's just so literal, it's just this little, little stalk of, dinner, and then how does it become numinous, or how does it become emblematic or totemic, that sort of thing. That certainly ties in with this idea of trying to be literal and precise, first literal, and then over time you start to see, oh, there's these other figurative things happening, but they all figurative meaning is more almost subjective. I think literal is sort of like what's actually happening. It's like it's factual, it's objective, it's descriptive, and then figurative meaning. I figurative is more subjective, and I think of it more in the realm of when you say what is it like, and then similes. It's like this. It was like that. And so it becomes more figurative meaning is more, I attach it more to the characters' experiences of the concrete world that I give them. Look at a bundle of asparagus and it looks like, and then the kind of, if that's more the source for the similes and the metaphors, then it feels like they come from within inside the character. So it's more like, what was it like for the character, as opposed to me sort of coming up with clever similes and metaphors and figurative and kind of deploying them. It feels like it kind of, and then I'm just obsessed with how far you can go with description, and I'm very anti-explanation lately. If you're bringing your reader into the mysteries of being human and who are we and all this sort of stuff, you're kind of past the threshold where anything like explanation is possible. Sometimes you dramatize a character's search for meaning or whatever, but in the book itself, it's just more, description is meaningful. And to that end, one of the things I found over the course of writing these 3 novels is I realized that as a writer, at a certain point, it's just personal taste. It's just like what you pursue, when you're kind of, again, alone, for all those years, just like, this better be interesting because I'm going to be sitting here but I just realized that I was always trying to get meta, I was always trying, transcendent. We think of it as being like, we want to elevate, up into, and I started getting these interesting things happening where rather than trying to peel up, off and over and above and transcending, by being precise, I was going deeper and deeper into immanence, deeper and deeper into just the actual concrete, like it's like, and at a certain point, the detail, it becomes surreal. It's almost like you get so imminent that you break through into some deeper plane or dimension or whatever, but not by going up and over, but by going deeper into it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think too, a lot of the things you're describing, like in my mind, and this is maybe a less articulate way to say that, but that's, instead of the job or thinking of your job as imparting, meaning or assigning meaning, for the reader, and instead inviting them to collaborate by providing these images and these, and you had talked a little bit about your inspiration. I know you have some source material that you use to inspire the paintings. I was wondering if you might be able to share some of those.
Yeah. So my rave still life painter is a kind of this obscure Dutch painter from I think the late, probably 18th century, Adrian Court. So it's kind of philosophy, but there's the painting, there's the cover of his book. And the guy that owns that estate owns one of Adrian Court's paintings. And I just thought that'll be cool.
Yeah.
I wanted to describe the gooseberries, but and then there's this Charles Ethan Porter. And so this is the painting of his, of the hay being mown. I just thought, oh, well then, what would it look like if somebody saw him painting that painting out in a field? So things like that. And then just because I have it here, there's a character in the book called Zachary Hand to God Proverbs, and what he does is he lives in a tree and he carves like biblical scenes into the tree. And I just got that from when I was up in Toronto 10 or 15 years ago now at the International Festival of Authors. I went to the big Toronto Museum, and there was a show that was an exhibit of medieval ivory sculptures in engravings, and I thought that would be really cool if I had a character who could carve that kind of stuff into a tree. So that's just kind of what I mean about, I thought that was cool. And I thought, what would it be like to take a painting or a sculpture or a piece of music and just put it into words? How does it transpose? And so it starts off as just like, can I do that? Can I describe that in a way that would be evocative, in the reader's mind? And then it insinuates itself in the story as well, character too.
Would you say like this process that you're describing, like sort of pulling inspiration from these artists who you've come across over, the course of many years, and, this island that grabbed your interest, all this like synthesizing work you're doing, is that different than your previous two books, you would say, or is that?
It was more explicit this time. I was I more deliberately wanted that kind of synthesis. I wanted to work with as many different kinds of, and that's just another challenge I set for myself, which is I want to make this, it's 200. I want the book to be, if the book is about 200 pages long, that's like the size of my brain. Like I can't write a book that's any longer than 59,000 words or something. But I wanted, I wanted to be able to just layer it with all these sorts of things. And one of the challenges was, I want somebody who doesn't know about these paintings, somebody who doesn't know about Shakespeare, somebody who doesn't know about the Old Testament, somebody who doesn't know about Keats or Ovid or any of the stuff that's in there. If you don't know about that, you will not be excluded. No reader will be excluded from you can go through the book and the book embodies its own meaning. But if you do know that, or you read it once and then 5 years or 10 years later, you happen to go back and you've read some of that stuff, you can go just deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the book. I think that also has to do too with just, I've been fascinated with the idea of deliberately writing the book, presuming, it's a big presumption these days, that people will read it more than once. Mm-hmm. And so that when a reader goes through a book the first time, we all know, you only get a certain amount of it, right? Because what you're doing on the first time you're going through a work is, you're not familiar with it yet. So you're acquainting yourself with it. But then, so that I would think about, okay, so if a reader just finished the book and went back to the beginning, and I kind of have an idea of what they bring with them from their first reading, how with that in their mind, when they go through a second time, what will start to open up, And I say this all the time, but, read literature, reading books is the only art form I can think of that people say, oh yeah, I read that book once. It's my favorite book. I read that book once. Like nobody says that about their favorite album. Nobody says that about their favorite movie, and so, like, oh, The Godfather, it's my favorite movie. I saw it once. It was the best, but that idea that, whatever your favorite works of art are, familiarity breeds the opposite of contempt. Like, so knowing it more and more intimately actually deepens, your experience of it. And it takes a place in your life that, you go to these places and they're familiar, that, and then you find more and more in them over the years. That's my experience with my favorite books. I do more rereading these days than reading. But I just thought, I'd like to write a book that's, that stands up to that kind of, that will keep giving. I think of it in terms of being generous to the reader, and just dignifying the reader's intelligence, and always just assume the reader's really smart. I want to blow their minds and break their hearts, and I want them to come back. I want them to want to come back for more, that kind of thing. And I always think about this woefully unattended kind of seminar that I went to with E.L. Doctorow once, and he was talking about, he's like, there is great dramatic tension in already knowing everything that's going to happen, because then you have the dramatic tension of inevitability. Anna Karenina, she's gonna die, and maybe she won't this time, whatever, that kind of, but you're still, it's gripping, and it draws you through. So just thinking about that, all that sort of stuff, keeping myself occupied,
Yeah, I was talking to students I had earlier this year about like first lines, and there are so many first lines that tell you the plot of the entire novel in the first line. Like Charles Portis does that, everyone from like Charles Portis to Donna Tartt to, and just giving you the story up front. And that, again, it's, using inevitability as a source of tension and suspense, and, generating further curiosity in your readers, in addition to all the other things all the other levels you're working on the sentence and those aspects of the book. To that point, I did want to ask about, like, and I think in this story, again, we come in knowing, what the fate of these islanders is going to be, by virtue of the basis of the novel, its inspiration, and we understand that this is a novel that is going to be in part about destruction and disruption, and violence, but there's also so much joy and idyll and beauty in it. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about striking that balance and what it meant to have, these long, rapturous passages where you're sort of lavishing your attention on the islanders, experiencing joy or gathering, or, singing and collecting wildflowers or digging for clams, and all these, or Bridget and Ethan passing time in the meadow, what those passages, how you thought about that balance between the story of disruption and violence and the story of happiness and idyll here.
Yeah, I think a lot about what it is in any given story that you declare but also embody as the subject. Like, what is this about? What is the most important thing? And the idea that because so in the book, to me, it's just these lives, it's these people's lives. And I just realized this book to work, it was just going to be mostly just spending time with the islanders and their families, their friends, their antagonists, and just kind of day-to-day life. But give that material, privilege that material with the most and the best of my attention, and with the narrative's attention and the best language of it. And I just had the sense that, another thing that kind of the way the book works is it moves the reader through all sorts of different points of view on the island, but also then outside of the island. You start getting, there's all sorts of, like, there are letters and newspaper articles and medical forms, and there's, copy from a museum, exhibit, all these sorts of things. And one of the ways that I want to kind of refract kind of what happens to their humanity is just when you're on the island, it's just they're human beings, and they are themselves, and they just think of themselves as getting along. And then the moment you start to get these other points of view, the language degrades. It degrades their humanity. It objectifies them. It's oppressive to them. And part of that too is just a challenge as a writer, or challenging the fact that I have, as a writer, you should have, want this repertoire of different idioms that you can use, But I think that there's certainly that sense too that things are given value in the direct proportion to the amount and the quality of time and attention you devote to them. And so I just felt like, well, if this book was going to work, the way it would most powerfully work would be most of the novel, 200, out of a 200-page novel, like 196 pages are with the family, and 4 pages are maybe when they actually get evicted. And partly, this just has to do with just the way our country is right now, and particularly, how difficult it is for people to talk about race and talk about history and all these sorts of things. And one thing I knew is that I didn't want that if I made it gratuitous, if I made it sensationalistic, if there was a preponderance of the actual violence, what would happen is that it would degrade into melodrama, and it would transfer the proper emotion, which is love, for these families and these people after you spend time with them, to they would cease to be the subject of the book. They would become objectified. The book would do them violence by subordinating their lives to the violence that they suffer. And I was just worried then that there would be a transference, like the subject of the book one way it could go sideways is if the subject of the book became the reader's self-righteous anger on behalf of these victims. That would just be the book perpetrating exactly the kind of thing that it's purportedly depicting.
Right. Yeah.
So just thinking about it that way just became one of the great, the real challenges of the book.
So I'm going to jump in and say we're starting to get some really interesting questions in the chat. The first one's from Jean Blasberg, who was one of the BookEnds fellows last year. She's wondering, Paul, when you decided to did you think from the beginning about the biblical layer in the book?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Partly because when I teach at Stony Brook, I basically A/B every other semester. I teach the Old Testament and I teach Shakespeare. So Shakespeare and the Old Testament, they're right at my fingertips. Throw them right in. But yeah, I did. Partly because to me the Old Testament is just like the great anthology of and model and kind of headwaters for so-called Western, but it's not, it's because it's in Egypt, it's in, but just like the oldest, and so those just poetry and lyric and narrative, they're the different genres that the anthology consists of, they're models of compression and beauty and sonority. And I don't read Hebrew, but I read very, extensive sort of kind of parsings of, this is the Hebrew word for this means this, and just the nuances. I look at lots of different translations. And I just love I love the idea of being, I consider myself part of this kind of transcendental kind of New England transcendentalist, just a kind of parochial New England villager sort of in some ways. But I love the idea of there being this unbroken tradition of, you have Moses and, if you say Moses was an author, if he authored Exodus or Genesis or whatever, you think of him as and he just took the old stories he had inherited about Babylonian cosmology and he made a whole new vision out of them, right? And then you have Shakespeare. The more I teach the Old Testament, the more I realize, oh my God, there's almost not a page of Shakespeare that doesn't have the Old Testament in it. It's just there. It's like literally there if you know and I go, oh, wait a minute. And then there's not a page of Herman Melville that doesn't have Shakespeare and the Old Testament in it. If you read Faulkner's The Bear, if you read like Sarah Orne Jewett, her novel, The Country of the Pointed Firs, that is definitely one of the models for this book. And there's Milton, and there's just all and this idea of I want somebody to read my book and have that look at Paul, looking at Sarah Orne Jewett, looking at looking at Faulkner, looking at Shakespeare, and just this beautiful kind of the sense of continuity. So yeah, the Bible definitely, because it's just always kind of at my fingertips, but also because I'm thinking about these kind of literary traditions through history.
And what you're talking about earlier with rereading, right? There's a real intimacy to that. It's not just about like reaching out to your reader, but it's also looking back and your own process of rereading.
Yeah. Yeah.
Creating a sense of inevitability in some ways, I think.
It is. It's really weird. And, I'm super into metaphysics. So this is another thing is I just like, I started thinking about, oh, look at me looking at Marilyn Robinson, looking at Zora Neale Hurston, looking at da-da-da-da-da-da. And so you think, oh, there's this kind of like relay of lenses or something that goes, kind of this really wild sort of thing. But then when you get all the way back to, whoever those Babylonians were, I thought, oh, what if you turn back around? And then that becomes something like prophecy or so, I don't know, like, because you're in poetic space, you can think about what would it be like to look back through those lenses and sort of see us looking through the binoculars, and prophecy is something it's in the Bible, right? But it's also it's something that I kind of explicitly play around with in the book too,
So Jean used the word layered to talk about the biblical layer, and Susie then asked a question about your editing process, and maybe that ties in some ways.
Yeah, it's the funniest thing. Yeah, I mean, there are certain. I was just thinking of some. I can't remember. There's something in the book where there's this guy Zachary Hand to God Proverbs. I love these old puritanical New England puritanical, and also like the South, and like down through the Carolina. People's names are often kind of like they were little poems almost that were almost taken from the Bible, but this just makes me think of a passage that might sort of illustrate this. Is one of the things that I found in the little bit of research that I had done reading a couple of articles about the Ion is that there were 2 or 3 articles that I had seen reprints of from the contemporary newspapers in 1912, 1911, and the islanders were described in 2 or 3 of these headlines as queer. Right, the queer South Sea Islanders of Malaga. And so I was like, queer, okay, it's 2023, we might be able to do a little layering, And so one of the things I did is I just, and I thought, this guy, Zachary Hand to God, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, just the way he said, you bet I'm queer. This whole idea of like, what, you queer to who? Well, how is that queer? What norm, And it's at a point in the book where he's, the emotional pitch is sort of, and he's like, yeah, you're freaking right. I'm queer about this. I'm queer about this. And I started riffing. And I was like, oh my God, you know what? If I do this right, it's going to read like a Walt Whitman poem. And so there's that layer. There's the queerness. Then there's the biblical. He's like Zachary Hand. He's like an Old Testament prophet. But then it's also sort of like he's channeling Whitman, but he's also channeling 2023. I allowed him to kind of intuit kind of what what he does with queer and queerness there, and let him riff on it. But then it ends with this line that's something to do with like here's my island, here is an apple, because it's called Apple Island, and there was an orchard there, and here is an apple for an island or something like that. And I realized, that's a direct quote from The Tempest. At the beginning of The Tempest, somebody says, what do you think some character makes of this island? And the other character says, I think he will put it in his pocket and take it home and give it to his son as an apple, or something like that. And so you again, it's just like riffing and riffing and riffing, and then you suddenly realize, wow, there's like 8 different things, different constituent things in there that are sort of patched together, stitched together, and it's cool. Like, it's cool when it works, like it's just. So part of it is like, it's just like, that's what I mean about the revision being writing, is it's just keep sifting and sifting and synthesizing and experimenting and trying, what is about this? What about this? Does this strike a good note? And you just find these like chords or resonances among these different layers. And then that goes back to that idea of, you could read it, and if there's enough layers, you could read it in 3 years, and your brain, because you'll be different in 3 years, your brain and the novel refract through your different brain differently in 3 years, and you'll still recognize it as the same book, but there'll be other stuff that is brought into relief or brought into the kind of the foreground, or the kind of depth of field will change as you go through it. But all trying to make it so that while you read it, every sentence just feels like it's just lucid and crystal and perfectly clear. Good luck. I mean, yeah, like I said, most of it's like 10 years of going bang, bang, bang. Like it's not, sounds good now, but how many nights, it's like, at 4 a.m, going, it's never going to work. It's never going to work.
You brought with those notebooks that they had the photo of in the New York Times, and as you're talking about sort of these different layers and how you can look. I mean, do those notebooks actually represent those different layers with all the different colored tabs?
Yeah, I'm a great maker of color coding, and then I can never remember what the code is. But this is how I write. I write on Post-its. And I just do it for, weeks and days. And then I write in the notebooks and stuff too, but then I just kind of put them all in, and then I go through and fart around with them, and I put cool little pictures that I come around. So they turn into these funky little artifacts. But even those, you go back around through, and it's a lot of it is just I spend like an hour a day whenever I can just reading the Oxford English Dictionary. It sounds stupid, but and just looking up, not even really looking up words. I just open it up and just start browsing through. And most often, I just stop on common words that you just use habitually. But one of a game I play with myself, is I'll stop myself and I go, wait, can you formally define, just some common word that you use all, and I started realizing, when I started doing this, I can't, I don't, everybody knows, and knowing it habitually through usage is not the same thing as so if you read, the cool thing about the Oxford English Dictionary is that every word, it will have a history of every usage, of the way that the usage of the word changed from Old English till right up to now. And so when you know that, you can get the sentences to end up feeling like they're layered, and they have, the words have these kind of, every word has its own little history. So you can use them in slightly not quite contemporary ways, but ways that the reader will recognize when it's used in context. And then that makes the language a little bit deeper and makes the sentence a little more resonance, I think.
Can I ask you a question about, this maybe relates or ties into usage. And also I think ties into that idea of layering and using those sort of inspiration texts like Melville. I think of Melville in the use of lists, and I think you are a great user of lists, especially in this novel. Can you talk about how you approach the sort of furnishings of the world of your characters in terms of, again, inventories seem important to these characters. And I mean that too, and, relates to the story of the Ark, right? What is the story of the Ark? Noah's Ark, but an inventory, right? Can you talk a little bit about inventories and lists and naming the physical world characters?
Yeah, I think you're right. It sort of invokes things into reality. I don't know, I'm a great lover of ephemera, so I like little collections of stuff and things, and who's the Stephen Milhauser, I feel like, is a writer that has a lot of little magical lists of things and gadgets and stuff and twigs, and if you're walking around the beach, or look at the pebble and this, and you bring it all home, and then you just end up with this stuff all over the place. And there's something about that, because I'm always doing it in the context of a character too. So this idea of almost like it's the spirit of the thing, and then these inventories almost start to embody the spirit. I definitely get that explicitly from Henry James. Does that a lot. There's a lot of weird things he does where it's almost like people become holographic projections of their stuff, because the stuff with which you surround yourself is actually a projection or an extension of you. So you can kind of reverse that. But yeah, I don't know what it is. I just have this weird, and maybe it's because a lot of the books I love are kind of like those big kind of encyclopedic kind of novels that just put lots of just kind of, I don't know, something like the abundance of the world. There's something in, about the abundance of the world in there,
And it feels like to a lot of these characters are gatherers and collectors themselves. So they're characters with vocations or trades, or who, they show their agency through making things, or, building a house, painting a painting.
Right. Yeah. And that's the same thing with in tinkers, clock, they're crafts people, so some of these people are carpenters. And so it's interesting to look at their tools and talk about sometimes this is where you just find really cool language too. There's a little tone poem in the book about how you when you're making cedar shingles, how you there's a, I don't know if it's a, I don't know exactly now I can't, but there's a rhythm to it where you split the shingle off, and then it's like you split it, you throw it, you hoe it, like just these weird verbs that we use. They're so particular. There's a kid who's sharpening scythes during the hay mowing, and there's all these wild words that go with peening the blade, and you just think, oh, those are really cool. So partly it's just like you're just showing to the reader, like, look at these cool words, and look at these cool tools and what they do, and but then also just thinking about one of the things I love to do is just talk about like natural phenomena in the verbiage of different natural phenomena. So if it's clouds, I think about like, what are the verbs and nouns of water, and what happens when you describe clouds as like they're water, or if it's something describing water like fire or something like that, and just really experimenting. Like if something is a solid, describe it as if it's a gas, and so if it's a gas, act as if it's made of stone. You just really, and just see what like kind of pops out of that. A lot of times nothing does. You just cringe and you bury it in the backyard.
Is that like a part of that revision process that you talked about, where the writing as revision, and like the revision sort of strategies you use? Is that when maybe your research comes in more so than like the sort of inspiring spark?
Right. That's absolutely true. So I rarely look for. I look at the OED and I Google. What is that part of the boat called, or what is this, this thing and that thing, and you just find, but just enough to just sort of get through the scene, and get too lost in it,
So one of your former mentees, Sally Martell, is
Sally.
She's wondering if you could talk a bit about the publication process for this book.
Yeah, it took a long time. I was originally contracted with Random House, and was, first of all, I've just developed a kind of patience with this. I mean, as a private citizen, I'm impatient, but I've learned to be patient as a writer. So one of the things I do is when I started writing this book, I just hid from my author, my editor and my agent for years on end. They say, do you have any pages? No, I don't. I go hide under a tree, that sort of thing. Because one of the things because of the way that we've been talking, the way, right? Like, I don't want anybody walking around my house before it's pretty solid, that idea of other people's language or ideas. So I fend off people as long as I possibly can, until I almost feel like I have a working draft of the thing that's almost good enough to go to the copy editors. It's never the case, but and so then, I'd say like in about 2018, I sent it to my editor I sent it to my agent. She and I talked about it a little bit. I worked on it a little bit. And then I sent it to my editor at Random House, who's a woman named Susan Camel. And we were just starting to have discussions about it. I think I was very lucky, because the first time she read it, she's just like, why is this all out of order? I don't understand what's going on here. This is weird. And I said, Susan, it can't be told, it's going to be told. And she was not convinced. But then she had something where, Random House was like off buying Hogarth or something like this, buying some, and so she had to, we didn't talk for 3 or 4 months. And then when we got back together and talked about it, she had read it again, and she said, I get it this time. Like, it makes sense. I get it. And then I was actually going to spend a weekend with her and her husband at their house on Shelter Island, in the autumn, I think, of 2018. I can't remember the years. And she passed away. She died unexpectedly. She was diagnosed with, I think, lung cancer or something, and died like 2 weeks after she was diagnosed. So I became an orphan. I sort of and eventually, kind of long story short, what ended up happening is I got the book into the best shape I could get it, but also in exactly the shape I wanted it to be. It was as weird as you see, and just said that this is going to be the book I publish. If it's going to have my name on it, I'd rather do, so then my agent auctioned it off again, and just by this great coincidence, wonderful editor at Norton, Elaine Mason, who, one of these like personally cosmic coincidences. I had met her. She was the first editor I ever met when I was at an MFA program, and I was buddies with this guy who was the book buyer for the Prairie Lights bookstore out in Iowa City. Wonderful guy. And we just got along. He's like, you know what? I'm having dinner tonight with a big time editor from Norton. You want to come? I was like, so scared to death. And I had dinner with her. And to this day, I'm sure that she ordered rabbit for her entree, but she says, no, I've never eaten a rabbit. Anyways, all these years later, just sort of for her to come back. And it was just amazing. It was just so incredible. And she knew that I had been working on the thing for a long time, and that it was, years in the, in the birthing. And so rather than sort of making a pitch to me about this is what we'll do, this is what we'll do, this is what we'll do, she just edited the book. She just did a full edit and gave me a full author editor's letter. And she just said, this looks good to you. We've already started. If not, thank. And she just went in and, for all the authors out there, you're working on your manuscript and you're that close, right? And there's always like, you probably actually haven't written like the two most difficult scenes in the whole book, like make the whole book. Because, they're like, that's going to be really hard. I don't know how I'm going to do that. She just went and said, this, and this. And they were literally the three things I needed to do. But then she said, what if you looked at this one from this angle? What if you looked at this one, not so much like this, but like that? And just like tumblers in a lock, just the whole book. I was like, oh my God. I said, just give me 2 weeks. And I just went back and just did it all. It was great. So that was, all's well that ends well, blah, 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 blah. But just for everybody out there who's, trying to, sell their manuscript, the first person that we sent it to before we auctioned it the second time, we, my agent and I did that. Okay, on the count of three, we're both going to say who we think you should send it to. We went 1, 2, 3, and we both said exactly the same editor. And this editor is everybody who's within the sound of my voice knows who this editor is. Very, very well-known, famous editor. And we sent it to this person, and this person said, this is terrible, and it's a real tragedy what happened to you, and this is artificial, and it's self-conscious, and it's absolute crap. It never ends, people. It never ends. And you have to learn how to say, I disagree respectfully, or you just say it's just not for you. It's not for you, but you have to have that. You reject your rejections. So yeah, it's now here we are, but yeah, you have to, it never, that sort of never goes away from being when you're publishing.
Can I ask a question about that relates to, you said, you worked on this book for a long time and you sort of like hid it away and you kept your process sort of like close to the chest. How do you know when you're done? When you're working on something for so long, with a project as, big and meaty as a novel, like how do you, I once heard a writer say that this was Robin Black, and she defined it. She knew when she was done, when she could explain to herself every craft choice she had made. And I always thought that was like useful.
That's cool. It's so, another person, awesome bookends person with whom I worked, Greg Phelan, did the cool thing with a couple of the sentences from the book. And one of the things was like, I can look, when I look at my students' work, I can talk about, but when he did that with that sentence, I was like, I didn't know I was doing all that sort of stuff. So I don't know I'm making these craft choices when I'm doing it, because I'm kind of like, it's like being a musician. You want to have your chops up so that you're not even thinking about your chops, right? You're just deploying them, right? And so in that, when I've got that hat on, I'm not thinking about that, with finishing the books, the metaphor I always use is like, I'm one of those robot vacuum cleaners, and I just go pop, 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 ding, and then I just back up and go, and there's just this weird thing, because it's so iterative and I keep going over it and over and over and over and over it for years. There's been a point with each of these 3 books where I just literally, there's been a day where I go, I think everything's I think I told the story. Like I've said all, I think I've said all that needs to be. And part of that is, one of the things I always talking about with my students is what's the story though, because the book could go on forever, but the book is a story, right? These characters' lives go on forever, the world goes on forever, but you have to think about, what is the story you're telling? And that's just that very intuitive kind of sense that I have I think I've told the story. And then it's years of just sort of like, but am I telling it as well as it could be told? Has it been choreographed the right way, arranged and sequenced? And and then you're just doing this like super, I think of it as like, having my jeweler's loop out and just, doing that kind of work on the sentences and precision, trying to make every sentence mean exactly what it says and say exactly what it means,
That's pretty much a beautiful place to end this conversation. And I want to thank you both so much. This was fascinating and wonderful. Great questions, Kate.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I just want to remind everyone, we're going to be back with this book club on April 5th to talk with Daisy Albert Florin in conversation with Susie Merrill, one of the program co-directors. And then on May 24th, we'll be here with Vanessa Cutie and Allison Fairbrother. So thanks so much, everyone, and have a wonderful night.
Thanks, everybody. It was fun.
Thank you.